There's a book on a desk in a Paris apartment. It has been on that desk since July 1971, in the sense that the desk and everything on it have been documented, catalogued, and preserved with the specific care of people who understand that what they are handling is no longer simply furniture and objects, but evidence of a life that the world has decided to regard as significant. The book is a paperback, its spine slightly cracked from having been opened many times, its pages soft with use. It is open to page 211, and on page 211, Jim Morrison placed a bookmark, not a formal bookmark, not a piece of ribbon or a purchase card, but a torn strip of paper from what appears to be the margin of another page, folded once and inserted at the top of the page so that the fold was visible above the book's upper edge when it was closed. He did not turn down the corner of the page, which was his usual habit with books he wanted to return to. He used the bookmark instead, and then he closed the book, and then, within days of closing it, he was dead. The apartment at 17 Rue Beautreillis in the Marais district of Paris had been Jim and Pamela Corson's home for 4 months. It was a third-floor apartment with tall windows that admitted the specific quality of Paris morning light, golden and slightly diffuse, arriving at an angle that made the dust in the air visible and gave the room the quality of a painting rather than a lived space. The desk sat by the largest window. It was where Jim wrote each morning. It was where he kept his current reading. It was, in the truest available sense, the center of his interior life during the Paris months. The book is Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in a French translation. Published in 1963, Jim had read Nietzsche since adolescence, had carried Thus Spoke Zarathustra through military housing units and UCLA dormitories and hotel rooms on tour and the various apartments that the touring life had deposited him in and then lifted him away from. He had referenced Zarathustra in interviews, had spoken about Nietzsche's influence on his thinking about performance and self-construction and the relationship between art and the will to create. Nietzsche was not new territory for him. This was not a first reading. The particular edition Jim was reading, the 1963 Gallimard translation by Genevieve Bianquis, was one he had acquired sometime before the Paris months, its condition suggesting several years of use. The translation was considered among the better available French versions of Nietzsche, closer to the German in its refusal to smooth the text's difficulty into readable accessibility. Jim read it in French, which he spoke adequately if not fluently, the slight resistance of the language requiring more deliberate engagement than a native reading would have demanded. This deliberateness may have been part of the appeal. Jim was not looking for easy. What was at page 211, what the bookmark marked, what Jim had been reading in the days before his death, what he had stopped at and chosen to be able to return to, was a passage from the section titled On the Vision and the Riddle, in which Zarathustra describes the confrontation between the self and its own heaviest thought. The passage is dense and difficult in the original German, and the French translation Jim was reading did not simplify it. But its essential argument is this, that the hardest thing a person can do is to will themselves forward, not in spite of the recurring nature of their suffering, but because of it. That the weight of repetition, the awareness that everything that has been will be again, that the patterns of a life do not simply resolve but return, is either the heaviest burden or the greatest liberation, depending entirely on what the person does with the recognition. Depending on whether the recognition produces paralysis or a different and more honest relationship with the act of living. The researcher who first identified the significance of the bookmark had spent 4 years learning to read Jim Morrison's mind through the evidence of his reading. What she found on page 211 was not, she said, a surprise. Sophie Marchand, the researcher who first identified the significance of the bookmark, was a woman named Sophie Marchand, a French academic who had spent 4 years working on an annotated bibliography of Jim Morrison's literary influences as part of a larger cultural study of American artists in Paris in the late 1960s and early 1970s. She had access to the apartment's contents through the cooperation of the estate, and she had catalogued the books on the desk as part of the general documentation. She had noted the bookmark in Thus Spoke Zarathustra and had recorded its location, page 211, in her catalog without initially attaching particular significance to it beyond the basic archival notation. It was not until she sat down to read the passage herself that the significance became visible to her. Sophie Marchand had come to this work through a circuitous path that itself said something about the kind of thinking the work required. She had begun as a scholar of French surrealism and had arrived at Jim Morrison through the surrealists. Influence on his poetry through the same Rimbaud and the same Baudelaire that were on the desk in the Paris apartment. She had spent 4 years understanding, as completely as a scholar can understand, the contents of another person's reading life. This is a peculiar and intimate form of knowledge. It gave her access to Jim Morrison's mind that was different in kind from biographical knowledge. It was not knowledge of what he did, but knowledge of how he thought. She later described the experience of reading page 211 in the context of everything else she had learned about Jim Morrison's final year as one of the strangest professional experiences of her working life. Strange in the specific sense of recognizing something she had not expected to recognize, of finding a connection that felt too precise to be accidental and yet could not be confirmed as deliberate. She said, "I cannot tell you that he stopped there because that passage meant what I think it meant to him at that moment. I can tell you that if I had been in his position, in that particular phase of his life, that is exactly the passage I would have stopped at." What Sophie Marchand was describing was the experience of reading a book as a form of biography, of using a reader's choices, the places they stop and the places they return to and the places they mark for return, as a map of their interior life at a given moment. This is not a precise science. A bookmark is evidence of interruption as much as it is evidence of intention. A person who is reading and is called away for dinner leaves a bookmark in the same physical place as a person who reads a particular sentence and puts the book down because the sentence has done something to them. The bookmark does not distinguish between these two acts. It records only the location. The precise science that Sophie Marchand was practicing was the science of reading as biography, the understanding that where a person stops in a book, where they mark and return and mark again, where they linger and where they move quickly through, constitutes a form of autobiography that is often more honest than the autobiographies people produce intentionally. We choose what we present in deliberate self-account. We do not choose or choose less consciously the passages that arrest us, the arguments that we find ourselves reading and rereading, the moments in a text where the encounter between the words and the self produces enough resistance to slow the reading down. And yet, Sophie Marchand's observation that page 211 was precisely the page she would have expected Jim Morrison to stop at, given everything she understood about his interior life in the Paris months, is not nothing. It is not proof, but it is the observation of someone who had spent 4 years studying Jim Morrison's relationship to the ideas that shaped him. Her observation carries the weight of that expertise, and the weight of that expertise is not nothing. Jim Morrison arrived in Paris in March 1971 with Pamela Corson and with the specific intention of writing, not performing, not recording, not being Jim Morrison the cultural phenomenon, but writing in the private and sustained way that the touring years had made structurally impossible. He had been writing in notebooks since adolescence. The notebooks were where he actually lived, where the thinking that eventually produced the music had always begun, where the real work happened before it was transformed into something shareable. Paris was supposed to give him the conditions that the private practice of writing required: time, solitude, the daily uninterrupted mornings before the city woke. He had those conditions in Paris. He used them. He wrote every morning in a small notebook he kept on the desk by the window before Pamela was awake and before the world had made its daily claim on his attention. He was also reading. The 7 books on the desk documented 1 week of reading, the intellectual company he kept in those final days. Among them, Arthur Rimbaud's complete works in the Pléiade edition, The Pages Well Worn, a French novel by Céline, a collection of Baudelaire's prose poems, Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano, which he had read before and was reading again, the second or third encounter with a book being always different from the first, the knowledge of how it ends changing the experience of following it toward that ending. And thus spoke Zarathustra, open to page 211 with the torn strip of paper folded at the top of the page. What the Nietzsche passage says, what Jim was reading in his final days, is worth understanding in its particularity. Zarathustra is addressing the question of what a person does when they understand that the patterns of their life are not problems to be solved, but conditions to be inhabited. That the heaviness of those patterns, the recurring nature of the same struggles and the same limitations and the same distances between who one is and who one is capable of becoming, that this heaviness is not an obstacle to living, but is potentially its content. The passage argues that the person who can say yes to this, who can will themselves forward in full awareness of the returning nature of things, is the person who has arrived at the most honest relationship with their own existence that is available. The recurring nature of things was a theme Jim Morrison had been writing about since his earliest notebooks, the lived experience of recurrence, the discovery that the same questions and the same distances showed up regardless of what the external circumstances changed. Paris had been an attempt to find a different relationship to this fact. The notebook suggests that the attempt was, at least in part, succeeding. Jim Morrison had been struggling across the Paris months with a version of this question. The notebooks document it obliquely but consistently, the recurring attempt to separate the public self from the private one, to find out what remained of the poet when the performer was set aside, to understand whether Paris had provided enough space and enough silence for the answer to arrive. The answer, as far as the notebooks reveal it, was not clean. The private self was still there, still writing, still thinking, still finding its way toward the kind of honesty that the public work had always been reaching for. But the separation that Paris was supposed to enable had not been as complete as Jim had hoped. The persona followed him. The questions followed him. The recurring distances followed him, as Nietzsche could have predicted they would, because recurring things recur regardless of geography. Page 211 is where Jim Morrison stopped. Whether he stopped because the passage said something to him at that precise moment, or whether he stopped because dinner was ready, or because Pamela called from the other room, or because any of the 100 ordinary interruptions of daily life intervened at that particular line, this cannot be known. Sophie Marchand's careful scholarly instinct is that the former is more likely than the latter, because of what the passage says, and because of what the Paris notebooks reveal about what Jim was thinking about in those weeks. But instinct, even scholarly instinct, is not proof. Sophie Marchand published her findings about the bookmark in a footnote in her 1998 study. A footnote because her scholarly caution would not permit her to place it in the main text, would not permit her to claim, in the body of a work that would be reviewed by other scholars, that a bookmark in a paperback Nietzsche constituted evidence of anything beyond the location of an interruption. The footnote reads, in part, "It is perhaps worth noting that the passage marked in Thus Spoke Zarathustra corresponds closely to themes that recur throughout the Paris notebooks, and that the deliberate nature of the marking device, a torn paper strip rather than the turned corner that was Morrison's habitual practice, may suggest that the stopping point was intentional. The author acknowledges that this reading cannot be confirmed and has been placed in a footnote accordingly. Sophie Marchand's footnote, when it appeared, received little attention from reviewers. Academic footnotes carry their most significant cargo precisely in those cases where the scholarly apparatus has compressed something that deserved more room into a space that the conventions of the form require to be small. The footnote about the bookmark is one of those cases. The footnote is the most honest available response to the evidence. It neither overclaims nor dismisses. It holds the connection in the space it actually occupies, between proof and coincidence, between evidence and interpretation, between the bookmark as physical fact and the bookmark as meaning. This is the space in which most significant things about human lives exist, not proven, not disproven, not fully knowable, but not nothing either. Jim Morrison carried Nietzsche through the length of his life, from adolescence to a Paris apartment in July 1971, reading and rereading the same arguments about what it means to be a self in the world, about the weight of recurring things, about the will to go on anyway. He came back to Nietzsche throughout his life, the way people come back to the writers who gave them the first real language for what they were already thinking, not to learn something new each time, but to find the same thing said again in the form that had always made it most true for them. Zarathustra had been that for Jim Morrison since adolescence. The book had traveled with him through everything. It was on the desk in Paris in July 1971 because it had always been wherever he was, carrying forward the same arguments about the weight of things and the will to go on and the question of what a person does with the heaviest thought available to them. He read to page 211 and stopped. He marked the page for return. He closed the book. He died. The book is still there. Page 211 is still there. The passage about the heaviest thought is still there, available to anyone who opens to it. What Jim Morrison would have made of it, in the reading that did not happen, is the question that has no answer and does not require one. The reading that did happen, the life's work of a person who thought seriously about Nietzsche's questions and tried to build something from the attempt to answer them, is the record that exists. It is the music and the poetry and the notebooks and the Paris mornings and the bookmark on page 211. It is more than enough to know that the thinking was real, that the questions were genuine, and that the person who closed the book had been, until the moment he stopped, still genuinely searching. That is the Jim Morrison who matters most, not the icon, not the symbol. The person who read Nietzsche in a Paris apartment in the mornings before the world woke, and who stopped on page 211, and who put a torn strip of paper in to mark the place, because he intended to come back to it, because he intended to keep going, because the search was still ongoing, right up until it wasn't.